Welcome. Before we dive into this terrifying story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because a lot of work went into uncovering the true events behind this chilling tale. Today, we're exploring the dark secrets of an Ozark family whose actions turned their home into a human slaughterhouse, leaving 11 travelers missing and a region gripped by fear. The Ozark family lived deep in the remote hills, where the roads were barely passable and the forest seemed to swallow anyone who wandered too far from the main path. They were known to the locals, though only in whispers, a family that kept to themselves, rarely seen in town, and always accompanied by an air of unease. Their homestead was isolated, surrounded by dense trees, with a rickety fence that creaked in the wind. The house itself appeared ordinary from a distance, a modest cabin with peeling paint and sagging shutters, but those who dared to approach often reported a strange feeling pressing against them, as if the land itself was warning them to turn back. The family members were never openly hostile, but they were cold and unnerving. They greeted strangers politely enough, but their smiles never reached their eyes. Children who passed near the property would sometimes run home in terror, claiming to have seen figures staring from the windows, or heard the sounds of chains and muffled screams carried faintly on the wind. Even the adults in the surrounding areas avoided the homestead, taking longer routes just to steer clear of it. Over time, the isolation of the property became part of the family's power. The remoteness allowed them to operate without oversight, and it created a shroud of mystery around their daily lives. Locals began to notice patterns that were difficult to ignore. Travelers who camped too close to the property or sought directions from the family sometimes vanished. At first, people attributed these disappearances to the dangers of the Ozarks. Wild animals, treacherous terrain, and accidents were common enough. But as more stories emerged of people entering the property and never returning, whispers of something darker began to spread. The family's behavior added fuel to these fears. Visitors noticed locked barns, hidden sheds, and a constant, almost obsessive secrecy in how they conducted themselves. Even their day-to-day routines seemed calculated, as if they were aware of every rumor and were deliberately fostering an image that kept others away. Despite the warnings, the homestead drew attention because of the mystery surrounding it. Travelers and adventurers, driven by curiosity or arrogance, occasionally approached, believing the family to be merely eccentric or misunderstood. Some went to ask for food, directions, or a place to rest, only to never be seen again. Those who returned, either by fleeing or surviving narrowly, spoke of the cabin's interior, describing rooms that seemed far larger than the outside suggested, hidden passages, and an atmosphere that weighed heavily on the mind. They spoke of strange implements and evidence of brutality, hinting at a methodical and calculated cruelty that the family had perfected over time. The family itself remained an enigma. Neighbors could not discern who was in charge, as each member seemed complicit in maintaining the secrecy and fear. Some reports suggest that the parents orchestrated the disappearances while the older children learned to lure or intimidate visitors. Over the years, the family became almost legendary in the Ozarks, not for their wealth, influence, or social standing, but for the terror they inspired simply by existing in that remote corner of the hills. Their homestead, ordinary to the untrained eye, became a symbol of fear, a place where the rules of society seemed suspended and where strangers who stumbled into their domain might never return. By the time word of multiple disappearances reached the authorities, the family had already established a near mythical reputation. Hunters, surveyors, and travelers spoke of the cabin in hushed tones, cautioning others to avoid the area entirely. Every detail of their isolated property, the dense woods, the crooked fence, the shadows cast by the setting sun, contributed to the sense that something unnatural thrived there. And though some still doubted the stories, the repeated disappearances and the unshakable feeling of dread surrounding the homestead made it clear to anyone paying attention that the Ozark family's remote residence was far more than it appeared. It was the perfect environment for secrets to fester and for unspeakable acts to remain hidden from the outside world. The first travelers to encounter the Ozark family were seemingly ordinary people, merchants, hunters, and wandering laborers who took the wrong turn on the winding forest roads. None of them intended to stumble into danger. They were simply seeking food, shelter, or directions. When they arrived at the homestead, the family greeted them with the politeness expected of rural hosts, offering water, a place to rest, or guidance for the next leg of their journey. On the surface, everything seemed normal, almost comforting. But those who remember the accounts describe a subtle unease that began as soon as they stepped onto the property. A chill in the air, a sense of being watched, and the faintest hint of malice in the smiles of their hosts. The first traveler, a young man named Thomas, had been carrying goods to a neighboring town. He stopped at the Ozark cabin late in the afternoon, hoping to rest until morning. The family welcomed him in, offering him a modest meal and a small room to sleep in. At first, the evening passed quietly, though Thomas noted the peculiar arrangement of the house. Doors that didn't seem to lead anywhere, windows that were blocked or too high to see out, and the strange, almost ritualistic placement of objects around the rooms. It gave him a creeping sense of discomfort, though he could not pinpoint why. By nightfall, Thomas had begun to feel the first real signs of danger. Strange sounds came from the walls, the scraping of metal, the thud of heavy objects, and low murmurs that he could not understand. The family had excused themselves under the pretense of household chores, leaving him alone in a room that suddenly felt confining, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. When he tried to leave, the doors seemed to resist, the latch catching in ways it hadn't before. Panicked, he peered out the windows, but the forest outside was impossibly thick, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows that made the trees appear alive. Other travelers reported similar experiences. A group of 3 hunters, seeking shelter from a sudden storm, found themselves trapped in the cabin after the family insisted they stay inside. The rain fell heavily outside, and when one of them attempted to leave, the family members blocked the door, politely but firmly, claiming the storm was dangerous. Inside, the men began to notice details that terrified them: knives arranged with precision on a table, strange stains on the floorboards, and locked doors that led to parts of the house they were told never to enter. By morning, only one of the 3 emerged, soaked and disoriented, refusing to speak about what had happened to the others. Over time, patterns emerged that made the family's intentions clear to those who survived. Travelers were often invited in under the guise of hospitality, only to vanish overnight. Some disappeared entirely, leaving no trace. Others managed to escape, but were deeply traumatized, describing a house that seemed to shift and grow, passages that led to nowhere, and rooms that held unexplainable horrors. The family's method was systematic, using the isolation of their property and the trust of unsuspecting visitors to lure them into danger. What terrified locals most was that the disappearances seemed premeditated. There was a rhythm to it. People who had no connection to one another would vanish after stopping at the Ozark homestead. Each case reinforced the growing suspicion that the family was not just cruel, but methodical, with a terrifying understanding of how to manipulate fear and control those who entered their home. Even when travelers tried to tell others what happened, their accounts were so bizarre and fragmented that the community struggled to piece together the truth. The family maintained a calm and polite exterior that concealed their sinister operations. No outward sign betrayed the horrors inside the house, which made the disappearances all the more chilling. It became apparent that they were masters at deception, presenting a facade of ordinary rural life while orchestrating something deadly behind closed doors. Their ability to lure people in and make them feel safe, only for that safety to be a trap, was what made the first travelers' disappearances so unforgettable and horrifying. Even today, the accounts of those first travelers serve as a haunting prelude to the full extent of the family's crimes. They illustrate the cunning and patience of a household that turned hospitality into a weapon and isolation into a tool of control. Each disappearance carried the same chilling signature: politeness, comfort, and familiarity, followed by vanishing without a trace. The first travelers were the unfortunate introduction to a terror that would leave the Ozarks forests haunted for generations. As the family's home became a silent marker of fear for anyone daring enough to enter, the early warnings about the Ozark family began quietly, whispered between locals who had lived in the region for generations. At first, it was small talk, almost dismissed as superstition: a missing traveler here, an unexplained scream in the woods there. But as the reports grew, so did the sense of unease. Farmers returning from distant fields would speak of seeing strangers approach the homestead and never return. Hunters and loggers, who knew the land better than anyone, began avoiding that stretch of the forest altogether. Even those who were naturally skeptical found themselves uneasy when walking past the family's property, sensing something in the air that could not be explained. Rumors painted a chilling picture of the family's behavior. Neighbors reported seeing figures moving at odd hours through the cabin's windows, or hearing sounds that were clearly human yet unidentifiable: cries, groans, and low whispers that seemed to echo unnaturally. Occasionally, someone claimed to catch sight of travelers who had gone missing, wandering the property as if trapped in a living nightmare. Even without hard evidence, these stories accumulated like a dark cloud over the area, convincing the local community that the family was no ordinary household. The family's demeanor added to the fear. Outwardly, they were polite and measured, never aggressive, and always careful to maintain the appearance of normalcy. But their politeness was cold, almost calculating, and many who interacted with them described a strange intensity in their eyes, a subtle sense that they were studying every visitor, cataloging weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The family's control over their property made the surrounding residents feel powerless. Anyone venturing too close risked disappearing, and the dense Ozark forest made pursuit or rescue nearly impossible. Farmers began posting warnings, telling travelers to avoid the area at all costs. Tales circulated of strangers arriving for a night's rest and vanishing without a trace. Some claimed they had heard the last screams of these visitors echoing through the trees at night, though no one could confirm where the sounds originated. These warnings were often dismissed by outsiders, yet the locals' fear was palpable and grounded in repeated, unsettling patterns. Those who tried to investigate often returned shaken and silent, unwilling or unable to recount exactly what they had seen. As word of the family's sinister reputation spread, neighboring communities became more cautious. Inns and taverns along the main routes began to advise travelers not to seek shelter near the Ozark homestead, noting that any interaction with the family could end in disaster. The disappearances became so frequent and consistent that a pattern was undeniable. Those who entered the property often never left. Observers noted that it was not a matter of chance. The family seemed to possess a methodical approach to selecting their victims and ensuring their presence remained concealed from the wider world. Stories of the family's behavior became the foundation for local folklore. Some described elaborate traps around the property, hidden pits, concealed doors, and rooms that led nowhere, though no outsider had been able to map them accurately. Others spoke of the family using their knowledge of the forest and terrain to ensure that anyone who tried to flee would become hopelessly lost. The Ozarks themselves seemed to conspire with the family, creating natural barriers and disorienting paths that worked in their favor. What made the warnings particularly chilling was that even those who managed to leave the property often came back changed. Survivors spoke of a weight pressing on their minds, an inability to articulate the horrors they had witnessed. Many abandoned the area entirely, unable to reconcile what they had seen with what they thought was possible in their world. The community's shared fear solidified over time, and the family's reputation grew into something larger than mere rumor, an almost tangible presence of menace in the Ozark Hills. The early warnings served a dual purpose. On one hand, they were a protective measure, helping locals avoid direct encounters with the family. On the other hand, they contributed to the growing mystique and terror surrounding the homestead. The Ozark family's combination of outward normalcy and hidden cruelty created a chilling paradox. The more ordinary they appeared, the more frightening the stories became. Those who dared to speak of them described a calculated, patient, and highly intelligent household, one that used fear itself as a tool, ensuring that the family's influence extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of their property. By the time outsiders began paying serious attention, the warnings had already done their work. Travelers were wary, investigators were cautious, and the locals remained vigilant. The pattern of disappearances, coupled with the family's cold, meticulous behavior, created an atmosphere where curiosity could be deadly. The early warnings, whispered in markets, churches, and taverns, became the invisible boundary around the family's domain, a line that few dared to cross, knowing that the consequences could be fatal. It was this combination of rumor, observation, and unexplained phenomena that cemented the Ozark family's reputation as dangerous and unpredictable. Long before anyone could fully understand the nature of the slaughterhouse they were running, the community's collective instinct had already recognized the threat. The early warnings were more than superstition. They were the first sign that something profoundly wrong was occurring behind the walls of that isolated homestead, and that those who ignored them risked vanishing forever. As more travelers disappeared and rumors spread, the patterns of the Ozark family's methods began to emerge, even if the details remained shrouded in fear and speculation. The disappearances were never random. There was a calculated precision to how the family operated, using the isolation of their homestead and the dense, confusing terrain of the Ozarks to their advantage. Locals who observed the area noted that travelers were often lured in by what seemed like ordinary hospitality: a warm meal, a bed for the night, or guidance on treacherous roads. Once guests accepted these offerings, however, they were effectively trapped. The family had an uncanny understanding of human behavior, knowing exactly how to gain trust before manipulating their victims into vulnerability. The methods were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, which made it all the more terrifying. Doors that were normally unlocked would suddenly jam, or windows that seemed clear would obscure the view outside. The family's movements were quiet, measured, and deliberate, ensuring that visitors never suspected anything amiss until it was too late. Those who tried to leave found the environment conspiring against them. Paths in the woods seemed to shift, the forest grew thicker, and sounds that should have been familiar became disorienting. Every element of the property was engineered to confuse and intimidate, keeping the travelers off balance and making escape increasingly difficult. Inside the house, the arrangement of the rooms contributed to the sense of entrapment. Hidden passageways, false doors, and partitions created a labyrinthine structure that made navigation almost impossible for those unfamiliar with it. Travelers reported that rooms seemed larger than they should, or hallways extended farther than possible, adding to the psychological strain. Even without witnessing direct violence, the atmosphere alone was enough to induce fear, anxiety, and the creeping sensation of being watched. The family knew how to manipulate these emotions to their advantage, ensuring that their victims felt powerless from the moment they arrived. The disappearances followed a disturbing rhythm. Certain types of travelers, merchants with goods, hunters traveling alone, or groups unfamiliar with the terrain, were more likely to fall prey. The family appeared to track who passed by, noting behavior and assessing risk before acting. Once a decision was made, the trap was set with precision. In some cases, victims were never seen again. In others, they managed brief encounters with the hidden horrors inside the house before meeting their fate. The combination of psychological manipulation and physical isolation made the family nearly impossible to confront or escape. Over time, the locals began documenting the events, albeit informally, to establish a clearer understanding of the pattern. Survivors' accounts, though fragmented and inconsistent due to trauma, pointed to a chilling consistency: polite lures, subtle intimidation, and the complete exploitation of the surrounding wilderness. Even those who were aware of the danger often underestimated the family's cunning, believing that sheer caution or bravado would protect them. Unfortunately, the family had anticipated this overconfidence, turning every instinct of survival into a potential weakness. Evidence suggested that the family's cruelty was not haphazard, but methodical. Tools, implements, and hidden rooms inside the house indicated premeditation, while the deliberate maintenance of outward normalcy allowed them to avoid suspicion for years. Neighbors described seeing the family interact politely with outsiders, sometimes even offering guidance or small gifts, which served to reinforce the illusion of harmlessness. The juxtaposition of civility and horror heightened the terror of the disappearances, making it clear that the family was not simply acting on impulse but executing a carefully constructed plan. As reports accumulated, the local population became increasingly fearful, but direct intervention was rare. The Ozark wilderness was unforgiving, and approaching the homestead without preparation was dangerous in itself. Law enforcement was limited, and the family's ability to manipulate appearances made it difficult to gather evidence. Each disappearance reinforced the notion that the family operated with impunity, using the isolation of their environment as both a shield and a weapon. Even those who never entered the homestead felt the reach of the family's methods. Travelers passing nearby would often turn back at the last minute, influenced by warnings or sudden feelings of dread. The psychological grip extended beyond the property itself, creating a zone of fear that encompassed the surrounding hills. This invisible boundary made it clear that the family's power was not merely physical, but also psychological, relying on terror to control both victims and witnesses alike. Ultimately, the family's methods reveal a disturbing intelligence and patience. They understood the terrain, human psychology, and the vulnerabilities of travelers, and they combined these elements to create an environment where survival was almost impossible. By the time authorities or outsiders began to piece together the scope of their actions, the pattern had been reinforced so thoroughly that the family's reputation alone was enough to keep most people away. Every disappearance, every whispered warning, and every unexplained event contributed to a carefully maintained system of control, turning the Ozark homestead into a deadly trap for anyone unfortunate enough to cross its threshold. The accounts of locals who encountered signs of the family's slaughterhouse operations paint a chilling and vivid picture of calculated cruelty. Those who lived near the homestead often spoke of unusual noises that drifted across the hills at night, low, guttural sounds that resembled human suffering but were difficult to place. Some described chains clinking or the creak of heavy doors opening and closing, though the family's property was supposedly quiet and secluded. The sounds were never consistent, sometimes coming from the house itself, sometimes from hidden outbuildings or sheds that were locked tight and never explained. These auditory hints created a sense of dread among the neighboring community, a constant reminder that something dark was unfolding just beyond view. Physical evidence also emerged over time, though it was often subtle and fleeting. Hunters and travelers passing near the property reported glimpses of unusual arrangements in the yard, disturbed earth, areas where the soil appeared freshly turned, or patches of grass that were unnaturally trampled. Some claimed to see what looked like bloodstains on wood or stone, quickly disappearing with rain or sunlight, leaving only the uneasy sense that something terrible had occurred. Others discovered hidden paths leading into the woods, which were worn as if people had been dragged along them, disappearing into dense trees that no outsider could navigate easily. These signs, pieced together over time, suggested that the family had established a system for hiding evidence of their victims, exploiting the isolation and rugged terrain to keep the horrors secret. Eyewitnesses who came dangerously close to the family's operations often recounted moments that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. One man, a logger who worked in the nearby hills, claimed he stumbled upon a hidden shed, partially concealed by thick underbrush. Through gaps in the wooden slats, he said he saw tools arranged meticulously, some stained with dark substances that smelled metallic and organic. He did not linger, but the image haunted him for years, and he never returned to those woods. Another neighbor described finding a discarded piece of clothing, torn and stained, lying in a hidden path. It was human, though no one could identify to whom it had belonged, and when authorities attempted to investigate, the family denied any knowledge and seemed completely unconcerned, reinforcing the notion that they were confident no one could uncover their activities. The psychological impact of these discoveries was as powerful as the physical evidence. Locals began altering their routines, avoiding the forest at night, steering clear of the homestead, and warning travelers to bypass the area entirely. Children were told stories of the family as cautionary tales, a method of teaching them to respect the invisible danger that lurked in the hills. Even those who never entered the property felt the oppressive presence of the family's operations through stories and unexplained phenomena, distant screams, fleeting shadows, and sudden sensations of being watched. These indirect encounters were enough to reinforce fear, ensuring that the family could operate largely unchallenged for years. There were occasional attempts to confront or investigate the homestead directly, but these often ended in failure or inexplicable outcomes. Some who tried to document or expose the family's crimes reported sudden illness, equipment failure, or disorientation in the woods. Others claimed that attempts to follow tracks or hidden paths led them in circles, returning them to the starting point, as if the land itself conspired to protect the family's secrets. Survivors of near encounters spoke of being paralyzed by fear, unable to act until they were physically distant from the property, leaving the family's operations undisturbed. Even reports from outsiders who did not live in the immediate vicinity suggested that the family's influence reached further than expected. Travelers passing through the Ozarks often heard warnings from strangers, tales of missing people, strange lights in the woods, and unnatural sounds at night. These accounts reinforced the fear of the homestead and the surrounding area, giving the family a reputation that extended far beyond their physical property. This combination of subtle physical evidence and pervasive psychological influence allowed the family to maintain control over both their victims and the local narrative, creating an almost mythic aura of terror. The more the locals investigated, the clearer it became that the family was not operating haphazardly. Every discovery, whether a trace of blood, a hidden path, or an unexplained sound, suggested methodical planning and a deep understanding of how to evade detection. The family's use of isolation, secrecy, and fear as tools of control allowed them to maintain their operations while keeping outsiders at bay. Neighbors who witnessed the aftermath of a disappearance or found traces of evidence knew instinctively to avoid direct confrontation, fearing retaliation or becoming the next victim. In essence, the community's encounters with signs of the slaughterhouse were indirect, but devastatingly effective. The Ozark family had mastered the art of invisible terror, leaving subtle hints that spoke volumes without ever revealing the full extent of their crimes. Each discovery heightened fear and ensured compliance, creating a landscape where the family's dark operations could continue unchallenged. By manipulating both the physical environment and human perception, the family solidified their control, establishing a legacy of terror that would linger in the memory of the Ozarks, long after the events themselves had faded from immediate view. Attempts by law enforcement and outsiders to investigate the Ozark family's property were met with frustration, fear, and sometimes outright failure. The region itself was difficult to navigate. Dense forests, winding hills, and treacherous paths made any approach challenging, especially for those unfamiliar with the terrain. Officers who were dispatched to follow up on reports of missing travelers quickly discovered that the physical environment was as formidable as the family's cunning. Paths that should have led to the homestead twisted unpredictably through the woods. Streams and ravines created natural barriers, and the dense foliage obscured both sight and sound, making it nearly impossible to track footprints or gather concrete evidence. Even when law enforcement managed to reach the property's outskirts, they encountered an unsettling lack of cooperation from the family. The Ozark family presented a facade of normalcy, answering questions politely, inviting officers to observe their property, and claiming ignorance of any wrongdoing. Yet beneath this calm exterior, there was an unmistakable sense of manipulation. Investigators often felt subtly intimidated, as if every word, every glance, and every movement was being calculated to unnerve them. They reported that the family seemed unusually observant, noting even minor reactions and using them to maintain control over the interaction. Some investigators tried covert surveillance, attempting to monitor the homestead from a distance to catch any evidence of wrongdoing. These attempts frequently ended in failure. The dense Ozark forests concealed movement effectively, and the family appeared to know when they were being watched, taking steps to obscure any suspicious activity. Officers reported strange occurrences during these attempts. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Compasses spun aimlessly, and sound seemed distorted in the forest, making it difficult to distinguish natural noises from human activity. These anomalies fueled the belief among some that the family's property was almost supernatural in the way it concealed their operations. Local witnesses who collaborated with authorities often provided fragmented or inconsistent accounts, in part because of the psychological toll of their experiences. Survivors of encounters with the family described being intimidated into silence, either by fear for their own safety or by the sheer horror of what they had witnessed. Their testimonies, though alarming, were difficult to verify, and the family's outwardly ordinary appearance made it easy for outsiders to dismiss them as eccentric rather than dangerous. This combination of unreliable witness reports, challenging terrain, and the family's calculated misdirection frustrated every serious attempt to intervene. In some cases, officers did attempt to enter the homestead or inspect outbuildings for evidence of missing travelers, but these efforts often produced ambiguous results. Doors that should have been unlocked were suddenly sealed, rooms appeared rearranged, and hidden spaces seemed impossible to locate. Investigators who reported seeing faint traces of blood, discarded belongings, or other signs of human presence were often dismissed by their superiors, who considered the evidence circumstantial. The family's ability to manipulate appearances ensured that each investigation ended with more questions than answers, reinforcing their reputation for eluding accountability. Even outsiders not officially involved in law enforcement, such as wandering hunters or traveling merchants, faced difficulties when attempting to uncover the truth. Those who tried to map the property or document unusual activity often became disoriented in the woods, returning hours or days later with little recollection of their path. Some described seeing figures watching them from a distance or hearing sounds that seemed to follow them, increasing their fear and convincing them to abandon their inquiries. This created an almost self-enforcing cycle. The family's methods discouraged investigation, while the fear generated by those failed attempts further protected their secrets. Authorities who attempted to coordinate with locals found that the community itself was cautious, reluctant to risk interaction with the family. The Ozark family's reputation as dangerous and unpredictable created an environment where even the suggestion of confronting them was met with hesitation. Residents had seen too many travelers vanish or return traumatized and preferred avoidance to confrontation. This deference allowed the family to operate largely unchecked, knowing that the combination of terrain, fear, and local compliance worked in their favor. Over time, it became clear that conventional investigative methods were ineffective. Standard police patrols, inquiries, and search parties yielded little result, and the family's ability to maintain a benign exterior while conducting sinister activities made them nearly untouchable. Each unsuccessful investigation reinforced the perception that the family's property was an untouchable domain, a place where law enforcement and outsiders were at a disadvantage. This contributed to the aura of dread surrounding the homestead, ensuring that the family could continue their operations with minimal interference. Ultimately, the failures of law enforcement and outsiders highlighted the family's meticulous planning and understanding of both human behavior and the environment. They exploited the terrain, fear, and social isolation to prevent detection, creating an invisible shield that kept their activities hidden. The combination of skill, patience, and psychological manipulation allowed them to operate with impunity for years, leaving the surrounding communities helpless and reinforcing the terrifying mythos of the Ozark family and the disappearances that would forever haunt the region. The psychological profile and motives of the Ozark family members reveal a chilling complexity that goes far beyond ordinary criminal behavior. On the surface, they appeared to be a quiet, self-sufficient family living in isolation, yet every detail of their conduct suggested a deep understanding of fear, control, and manipulation. Their remote location in the Ozarks allowed them to cultivate an air of mystery, ensuring that the outside world rarely interfered with their activities. This isolation was not accidental. It was carefully chosen to create an environment where the family could exercise complete dominance over anyone who entered their domain. The family demonstrated an acute awareness of human psychology, particularly the ways in which trust could be gained and exploited. They presented a facade of politeness and civility, using seemingly ordinary gestures of hospitality to lure travelers into a false sense of security. Their calm, measured demeanor often disarmed outsiders, making it easier to manipulate them once they were within the homestead. This ability to inspire trust before betraying it reveals a level of planning and foresight that suggests not impulsive cruelty, but a deliberate and calculated strategy designed to ensure their victims' vulnerability. Their motives, while difficult to fully ascertain, appear to have been a mix of control, sadistic gratification, and the practical advantages of using outsiders to sustain their hidden operations. Some accounts suggest that the family derived a sense of power from the absolute dominance they held over visitors, orchestrating the disappearances in a way that reinforced their superiority and autonomy within the isolated environment. The disappearances themselves may have functioned as both practical solutions for maintaining secrecy and psychological exercises in demonstrating dominance, with each act reinforcing the family's position in the eyes of themselves and their local reputation. Members of the family seem to operate with roles and responsibilities that further enhanced their control. The adults coordinated the overall strategy, selecting victims and managing the household to ensure no evidence escaped, while older children were reportedly trained to assist in luring travelers and maintaining the illusion of normalcy. This division of labor indicates a deliberate socialization into cruelty, creating a system where everyone was complicit and aware of the consequences of stepping out of line. The family dynamic itself appears to have been a mechanism for sustaining both secrecy and psychological conditioning, allowing them to operate cohesively over years without detection. Fear played a central role in the family's psychological strategy. They were not only feared by their victims, but also by the surrounding community, which allowed them to extend their influence indirectly. Even rumors served their purpose: tales of disappearances, strange noises, and unsettling behavior spread quickly, deterring outsiders from approaching the property. The psychological leverage of this fear meant that the family rarely had to use overt violence to maintain control. The knowledge of their capacity for cruelty was often enough to ensure compliance, both from travelers and from locals who might have otherwise investigated. The family's meticulous attention to detail also points to a psychological obsession with perfection and control. Every aspect of the property, from the layout of the house to the management of hidden spaces and traps, seems designed to manipulate perception and limit options. Even natural elements, such as the dense forest and uneven terrain, were effectively incorporated into their control strategies, creating a landscape that worked in tandem with their psychological manipulation. This shows a high level of cognitive planning and foresight, indicating that their behavior was not merely instinctual or opportunistic, but informed by careful observation and long-term strategy. Motives may also have included a form of social dominance, particularly over outsiders whom they could brand as vulnerable intruders. The family's choice of victims often reflected those who were less familiar with the terrain or less equipped to defend themselves, suggesting that predation was targeted rather than random. This selective behavior implies a psychological need to assert superiority over those they considered weaker, using both fear and the physical environment to reinforce their perceived dominance. Additionally, the family's behavior indicates a possible desensitization to violence, cultivated over years of repeated exposure to horrific acts. Their calm, methodical approach to managing the disappearances suggests that cruelty had become normalized within the household, integrated into daily routines and interpersonal interactions. This desensitization allowed them to maintain outward appearances of normality while engaging in acts that would be unimaginable to outsiders. Their psychological cohesion, reinforced by shared complicity, created an internal system where empathy was suppressed and cruelty was rationalized as necessary or even routine. The Ozark family's psychological profile also reveals an uncanny ability to adapt and learn. They observed the reactions of both victims and locals, adjusting their methods to maximize fear and minimize risk. Survivors' reports suggest that the family could anticipate behavior, manipulate expectations, and exploit weaknesses with remarkable precision. This adaptability points to not only intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of human behavior that was integral to the success of their operations. Ultimately, the motives and psychological profile of the Ozark family were deeply intertwined with their environment, social dynamics, and deliberate cultivation of fear. They were methodical, intelligent, and ruthlessly strategic, using every resource at their disposal, physical, psychological, and social, to maintain control and evade detection. Their ability to manipulate both people and environment created a terrifying combination. A family whose cruelty was deliberate, sustainable, and nearly impossible to counter, leaving a legacy of fear that would haunt the region long after their actions became legend. Even as the full scope of the Ozark family's actions remained hidden, the lasting terror they inspired in the surrounding communities became undeniable. The disappearances of travelers were only the beginning. The stories, warnings, and whispers that followed them extended the family's influence far beyond the physical boundaries of their homestead. Locals spoke of an invisible presence in the woods, a sense of being watched, and an almost tangible unease that settled over anyone who dared approach the area. The terror was psychological as much as it was physical, with fear itself becoming a tool that amplified the family's power. Families in nearby towns altered their routines to avoid the homestead, often taking longer routes or traveling in larger groups to reduce the risk of encountering the family. Hunters avoided certain stretches of the forest. Children were warned not to wander near the property, and travelers were advised to bypass the area entirely. These precautions were not simply for convenience. They reflected a deeply ingrained belief that the family possessed the capacity for extreme violence, and that even the smallest misstep could lead to disappearance or death. The community's collective anxiety reinforced the family's control, allowing them to operate largely undisturbed. The legend of the Ozark family grew with each new account, gaining momentum as stories were passed along from generation to generation. Even those who had never witnessed the homestead firsthand learned to fear it through hearsay. Travelers from outside the region often arrived with tales of missing friends, eerie sounds in the woods, and glimpses of strangers disappearing into the trees, all tied back to the family's property. This network of stories created a web of terror, where the fear of encountering the family became as powerful as the reality of the disappearances themselves. Reports of strange phenomena further heightened the sense of dread. People spoke of fleeting shadows at the edge of the forest, sudden chills, and the faint echo of footsteps or voices where no one should have been. Some claimed to hear distant screams or cries that seemed impossibly close yet could not be located. Others described seeing small lights flickering in the woods at night, moving in patterns that suggested human activity, yet when approached, they vanished without explanation. These occurrences reinforced the perception that the family's reach extended beyond what could be seen, giving their legend an almost supernatural dimension. The lasting terror also influenced law enforcement and outsiders attempting to investigate. Many who approached the property were met with disorientation, fear, or strange accidents that thwarted their efforts. Equipment failed, compasses spun aimlessly, and unfamiliar terrain seemed to shift unpredictably. Even when authorities attempted to document evidence, the family's meticulous manipulation of appearances often left them with inconclusive results. The inability to verify claims only added to the fear, as it created the impression that the family operated above normal rules, capable of evading both justice and comprehension. The psychological impact on survivors and witnesses cannot be overstated. Those who narrowly escaped the homestead often carried the trauma for years, reluctant to speak of what they had seen. Their experiences fueled rumors and reinforced local caution, ensuring that the family's influence persisted even without direct action. In some cases, the mere mention of the family's name was enough to instill fear in children and adults alike, demonstrating the enduring power of their reputation. Over time, the Ozark family became more than just a household. They became a symbol of the unknown dangers lurking in the wilderness. Their homestead, though physically confined, projected an aura of menace that affected the broader region. Stories of vanishings, hidden traps, and sinister behavior created a psychological landscape where fear dominated rational thought. Even decades later, the legacy of their actions lingered, shaping local customs, travel habits, and collective memory. The lasting terror also served to protect the family's secrets. Fear ensured compliance, discouraged curiosity, and limited the number of outsiders willing to approach the property. By leveraging both actual violence and the anticipation of danger, the family created an environment where their activities could continue with minimal interference. The combination of isolation, calculated cruelty, and psychological intimidation allowed them to maintain dominance over their domain and control the narrative that surrounded them. In essence, the Ozark family's influence extended far beyond their immediate acts of violence. Through fear, reputation, and careful manipulation, they shaped the behavior of entire communities, creating a lasting legacy of terror that outlived the victims themselves. Their story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how isolation, intelligence, and cruelty can combine to create an enduring shadow over a region. Even in modern times, the memory of their homestead evokes unease, a testament to the power of fear and the indelible mark left by a family who turned terror into a lasting tool of control.